There are moments in history when a nation doesn't just fight a war, its very identity hangs in the balance. And when you look at China in the early 20th century, you see a country standing at the edge of collapse. Warlords dividing provinces like personal kingdoms. Foreign powers carving out influence zones. A weak republic struggling to hold itself together. And two rival visions of China emerging from the chaos, one led by the nationalists, promising a modern, unified republic, and the other led by the communists, calling for a totally new society built from revolution. And the big question became, which vision would win? Which ideology would define China? And how did this long, brutal struggle finally lead to the creation of the People's Republic of China? These are the questions that shaped the destiny of one of the world's oldest civilizations. And in this video, I'm going to take you through the dramatic story of the Chinese Civil War, its origins, its turning points, and the events that ultimately created the People's Republic we know today. So without any delay, let's start. To understand the Civil War, you have to step back to the collapse of China's last imperial dynasty, the Qing, in 1911. China had been battered by foreign invasions, unequal treaties, corruption, famine, and rebellion. The dynasty was broken, the old order shattered. The Republic of China was declared in 1912, but instead of unity, China fell into fragmentation. Warlords ruled the countryside, each with their own armies, taxes, and agendas. The central government was weak, and foreign powers, Japan, Britain, France, Russia continued to dominate major ports and territories. China was a nation in name, but not in reality. In this chaos, two rising political forces began to form. First was the Kuomintang, the Nationalist Party, led by Sun Yat-sen and later by Chiang Kai-shek. They sought a modern state, nationalism, and an end to foreign domination. The second was the Chinese Communist Party, founded in 1921, inspired by Marxism, revolution, and land reform. At first, these two forces cooperated under the First United Front with the goal of ending warlordism. But beneath the surface, suspicion and ideological tension grew. The conflict truly ignited after the Northern Expedition of 1926-28. Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist forces swept across China, defeating warlords and unifying much of the country under nationalist rule. But Chiang also turned against the communists, launching violent purges. Especially the infamous Shanghai Massacre of 1927, thousands of communists were executed, imprisoned, or forced into hiding. This betrayal shattered the alliance and triggered the first phase of the Chinese Civil War. The early communist movement was still small, scattered, and inexperienced. They retreated to rural strongholds, most famously in Jiangxi, where Mao Zedong began shaping his ideas of peasant-based revolution. While Marxist revolutions in Europe emphasized urban workers, China's reality was different. Peasants were the vast majority. Mao understood this and began building a unique Chinese revolutionary strategy. The nationalists, determined to crush the communists once and for all, launched a series of large encirclement campaigns. At first, the communists resisted successfully using guerrilla tactics, hit-and-run attacks, ambushes, mobility. But eventually, Chiang applied a more systematic strategy of blockhouses and slow strangulation, forcing the communists into a desperate decision: flee or die. That decision gave birth to one of the most remarkable survival stories in world history, the Long March. In 1934, roughly 80,000 communists broke through nationalist lines and began a year-long retreat across thousands of kilometers of mountains, swamps, grasslands, and icy plateaus. Hunger, exhaustion, disease, and constant attacks reduced their numbers to a fraction. But the Long March was more than a retreat, it was a defining myth of endurance, sacrifice, and rebirth. And it cemented Mao Zedong as the unquestioned leader of the communist movement. But then something happened that neither side expected. Japan invaded China in 1937. Suddenly, the internal conflict collided with a massive external threat. The Second Sino-Japanese War forced the Nationalists and Communists into an uneasy alliance against a foreign invader. But even during this alliance, both sides quietly prepared for the civil war they knew would resume once Japan was defeated. In many ways, the war against Japan became a competition for legitimacy. The Nationalists bore the brunt of the major conventional battles: Shanghai, Nanjing, Wuhan. Their cities were bombed. Their armies suffered tremendous casualties. They were recognized internationally as China's legitimate government. But corruption, mismanagement, and inefficiency weakened their credibility at home. Cities under their control often suffered from inflation, shortages, and authoritarian rule. The Communists, meanwhile, expanded their rural base dramatically during the anti-Japanese resistance. They used guerrilla tactics, mobilized peasants, implemented land reforms, and portrayed themselves as the true defenders of the people. Their reputation grew, and by 1945, the CCP had transformed from a fragile underground movement into a powerful political and military force. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, China celebrated, but it also stood at the edge of another conflict. The temporary alliance collapsed almost instantly. Both nationalists and communists raced to take control of territories and weapons abandoned by the Japanese. The United States supported the nationalists, hoping to stabilize China and counter Soviet influence. The Soviet Union, meanwhile, allowed the communists access to Japanese weapons in Manchuria. Negotiations between the two Chinese factions failed, and by mid-1946, the Chinese Civil War erupted again, this time on a scale far greater than before. At first, it seemed the nationalists would win easily. They had more troops, more equipment, foreign support, major cities, and international recognition. Chiang Kai-shek launched a massive offensive, capturing communist-held territories. But beneath the surface, the weaknesses of the nationalist regime were catching up. Their armies were poorly supplied, morale was low, corruption was rampant, and inflation devastated the economy. Soldiers deserted, civilians lost faith, and trust in the government evaporated. Meanwhile, the communists, now the People's Liberation Army, adapted brilliantly. They abandoned vulnerable cities and retreated strategically, avoiding decisive defeats. They reorganized, consolidated support in the countryside, and used guerrilla warfare to gradually wear down nationalist forces. And then, when the moment was right, they shifted to full-scale conventional warfare. One of the turning points came in Manchuria. The communists took advantage of the region as factories and railroads left by the Japanese and used it as a base to launch massive offensives. From here, the momentum of the war began to shift decisively. The end of the Second Sino-Japanese War should have been a moment for national unity, but instead it exposed the deep fractures within China. The communists and nationalists had fought a common enemy for 8 long years, but neither side trusted the other, and neither had forgotten the unfinished business from before the Japanese invasion. As soon as Japan surrendered in 1945, both sides rushed to seize as much territory as they could, particularly Manchuria, which the Japanese had turned into an industrial military base. Whoever controlled Manchuria would possess factories, railways, and the largest stockpiles of Japanese weapons left behind. And both Mao and Chiang knew it. For a brief moment, the United States tried to broker peace. American envoys attempted to bring Mao and Chiang to the same table, hoping to create a unified post-war Chinese government. But suspicion ran too deep. Chiang believed the communists wanted to overthrow the republic completely, and Mao believed Chiang wanted to crush the CCP once the Japanese threat was gone. The peace talks collapsed, and the temporary truce melted like ice in the sun. China stood on the edge of civil war once more, and this time, the conflict would decide the future of the entire nation. When full-scale fighting resumed in 1946, the nationalists initially held the advantage. They controlled major cities, air power, and much of the country's infrastructure. The United States supplied them with weapons and money. Chiang launched major offensives in Manchuria and North China, hoping to destroy the communist base areas before they grew too strong. But the nationalist government was already cracking from within. The corruption that had quietly lived under the surface now spread openly. Supplies meant for soldiers never reached the front. Commanders inflated numbers, stole funds, and treated the countryside harshly. Inflation spiraled out of control and ordinary people suffered terribly. As food grew scarce and money became worthless, trust in the nationalist government eroded day by day. The Communists did not win support simply because they promised revolution. They won support because they filled the gap left by a failing system. In many rural areas, CCP cadres implemented land reform policies that redistributed land from landlords to peasants. They punished abusive officials, reduced taxes, and spread the idea that the war was not just a fight between armies, it was a fight for justice. Whether one agreed with their ideology or not, the reality was that millions of peasants felt the CCP offered them something the nationalists had failed to provide: respect, stability, and a sense of belonging. This shift in public sentiment became one of the decisive factors in the war. By 1947, momentum began to shift. Although the nationalists continued to capture cities, the communists focused on encircling the countryside, cutting supply lines, and wearing down the nationalist forces through guerrilla tactics. Then, when the time was right, they shifted to conventional warfare. The communists reorganized, modernized, and rearmed, often using captured nationalist weapons. Mao Zedong and his commanders, such as Lin Bao, Liu Baqing, and Zhu Di, built a disciplined army capable of large-scale battles. The turning point came in 1948 with the Liaoshen campaign, the battle for Manchuria. It was here that Lin Biao's forces surrounded key nationalist strongholds, cutting off escape routes and isolating entire armies. As the nationalists struggled to hold on to their last supply lines, communist forces pushed harder, eventually capturing the city of Shenyang. The fall of Manchuria was devastating for Chiang Kai-shek. It meant the nationalists had lost their industrial base and were now fighting with fewer resources than ever. Next came the Huaihai campaign, fought in the plains of central China. Here, ordinary citizens played a crucial role. Peasants transported food, equipment, and ammunition for the communists, using carts, baskets, and even their shoulders. Historians often note that millions of peasants defeated the nationalists, and in many ways, it was true. The nationalist troops became trapped, unable to maneuver or resupply. Entire divisions surrendered, and others were destroyed. The nationalist army was bleeding faster than it could recover. Finally came the Pingjin campaign, surrounding Beijing and Tianjin. By early 1949, the communists controlled nearly all of northern China. The nationalist army, exhausted and demoralized, could no longer mount an effective defense. With each collapsed front, more troops defected or surrendered. The Republic of China's government began to lose its moral and political authority, even among its own population. Meanwhile, Chiang Kai-shek faced pressure from every direction. Inflation had destroyed the economy. Government officials were deeply corrupt. Troops lacked food, ammunition, and motivation. Even within his own ranks, some of his commanders criticized his strategies. In desperation, Chiang tried one last political rearrangement, stepping down temporarily in hopes that new leadership could save the republic, but the damage was irreversible. In April 1949, communist forces crossed the Yangtze River, the last major natural barrier protecting the nationalist stronghold in the south. Once the river was breached, the nationalist defenses collapsed rapidly. City after city fell with little resistance. Shanghai was captured. Nanjing, the nationalist capital, was taken. Chiang Kai-shek, realizing that the mainland was lost, ordered the government, military, and loyal supporters to retreat to the island of Taiwan. There, he vowed to rebuild and one day return, though history would move in a different direction. On October 1, 1949, Mao Zedong stood atop Tiananmen Gate in Beijing and announced the founding of the People's Republic of China. For millions listening across China, this was the moment the Civil War had ultimately been leading toward. A new government had risen, one shaped by revolution, war, and ideology. The world watched as China, one of the oldest civilizations on Earth, entered a new era. But the consequences of the Chinese Civil War did not end with the declaration of a new state. The war left deep scars across the country, broken families, destroyed villages, and the population weary from decades of conflict. The divide between mainland China and Taiwan became one of the central geopolitical tensions of the modern world. The United States and its allies backed Taiwan, while the Soviet Union supported the PRC in its early years, shaping the landscape of Cold War politics. The outcome of the Civil War influenced global alignments, regional conflicts, and diplomatic strategies for decades. Economically, China was exhausted. But the communist victory allowed the new government to restructure society according to its ideology. Land reforms expanded, industries were nationalized, and China began the long and complex journey of building a socialist state. Some changes brought stability. Others would later bring turmoil. But in 1949, one thing was clear. China had fundamentally transformed, not just through ideology, but through the sheer force of history. The Chinese Civil War was not a short battle or a simple struggle. It was a clash of visions shaped by foreign invasion, internal struggles, and competing dreams about how China should rise in the modern world. It created the political map we still recognize today, and its impact continues to shape Asia and global politics even now. And now that you've heard the full journey from the early tensions to the final victory, I want to ask you, do you think China's future would have been different if the nationalists had implemented reforms earlier and earned the trust of ordinary people? Share your thoughts in the comments.